So a little context to this: I'm a young guy in a town that no one in the last century would be able to pick out on a map, and I met someone who I don't think was human. It all started out so very plain. I woke up on a crappy bed that should have been thrown out last year with springs that are killing my back. Went to work at 8 at the Home Depot on the only road that ever gets any traffic, but it's still just a 10-minute drive from my house. Work just passed by. A few customers would come in to get big loads for construction sites, but they mostly just need us for the forklift. They already know where pretty much everything is, and almost all the rest of the customers were looking for returns and refunds, or which all the bathroom seats were on. I clocked out at 4, nothing exciting happened, no weird customer, nothing. I went home and tried to make something resembling a stir-fry, but I realized a bit too late I was missing half the ingredients that made it any good. So I decided to go to the store to see if anything was on sale to make the food taste like food. Food prices are far too high for someone making barely $15 an hour, basically robbery if you ask me. I must have sat there calculating my budget with my stomach for a good hour before deciding on some cheap frozen veggies and the smallest bottle of soy sauce I'd ever seen. People don't appreciate the relationship they have with food nearly enough. I haven't eaten the same since that day. It happened while I was leaving the store. It was almost like a grunting and grinding sound mixed with weird muffled noises. I know I should have just minded my own business and kept it pushing, but something broke through. I couldn't see anything and couldn't hear it well, but I did recognize one thing. A cry being muffled by a hand is something that even if you've never heard it before, your brain just knows what it is. It makes you want to see what it is. So I put my stuff down in my car and I go over to check what the noise was about. Dumb I know, but what can I say? Habits are hard to break and I don't know what else to do with them. I don't see it when rounding the corner. It's a weird array of buildings and the lights seem to be only on in the parking lot. It wasn't pitch black out, but not much better with the lights too far. So I walk into what looked like an area for employees to go in through the back. And that's when I see them. There must have been at least 6 guys on the ground. It was hard to tell with some of them being on top of each other. But that's not what caught my attention. The girls or women maybe. How old they were, but they looked college age maybe. There was 4 of them. I knew because they were just sitting there staring, hands over their mouths trying to push the cries back in, almost scared to make a sound. Yet none of them seemed to be gearing to run away. Almost like they were in a panic attack but trying to put it in a box, if that makes sense. But the strangest thing of all was the guy standing next to the guys on the pavement. He looked as if he had just come into the situation too. He didn't feel hostile, you know. Like that feeling you get when someone's been aggressive or threatening just wasn't there. He seemed almost bored. The closer I got, the more things I noticed about the scene. By the time I stopped, I was about 30 feet away. I could start to make out some objects on the ground, pipes and broken glass, a broken piece of wood. Almost all of it had some trace of struggle tied to it. None of the girls or the guy had any sign of struggle or something that made me think they had anything to do with the fight. The guy standing there looked to be early 20s, light skin, and couldn't have been taller than 5 feet 11 inches. He had almost black hair, or maybe it was dark brown, hard to tell. Just an average guy you'd pass on the street. But then I saw his eyes, they were so brown. And what first looked like boredom on closer look almost seemed like, I don't know what the word for it is. Like someone looking for the secret image in a picture but can't quite tell if it's even there. I don't know what made me not call out or ask him what happened. After all, this whole situation felt off. Did a big fight happen? Was he involved or just a passerby? Why wouldn't the girls take their eyes off him? And then he looked over to me. He didn't say anything, but I could almost feel the words popping up in my head from his stare. Like as if he was saying something about modern art or the state of affairs of young people. As if the vision couldn't be realized and he couldn't be bothered to try and understand anymore. While he kept taking glances at me, he began to walk around looking at the debris. Like he was searching for something in particular. He kept giving me side glances, almost as if picking out a gift for a friend, and he couldn't decide. The girls started crying harder as he moved, almost petrified when he came near them. Finally he picked up a piece of rebar and inspected it closely, and he gave me a look of something along the lines of a mighty sword. And he swished it around him, like a kid playing with his new favorite stick. Then he threw it near my feet. The sound of metal and concrete will never be the same to me again. Then while I'm looking between him and the rebar, a small grin began to form on his face with a look of, "You don't like my present?" My brain, being sensible, told me I should pick it up. After all, if he was the one who messed up 6 guys by himself, a weapon was mandatory. Quick of a thought that was, came something far more sinister. His grin was beginning to widen and morph to a bigger smile. His feet, I noticed, were almost sideways, his legs sounded heavy, and the way he walked seemed almost as if it took great effort to do so. He walked so casually, as if he was about to greet a long-time friend he hadn't seen or heard from in a while. Maybe that's what it would have looked like from a camera. Every one of his steps triggered something in me, something almost instinctual. I still hadn't said anything, and I barely so much as twitched. But I knew what this feeling was. Prey isn't the right word for it. I was a part of the dinner show. Something like a cat would do with a mouse he had no interest in eating, only making it suffer before the end. Priding itself on the pain of things weaker than it. It was suffocating when he was in front of me. He looked down at the rebar and then back to me, almost pleading for me to pick it up, like a kid. So a little context to this: I'm a young guy in a town that no one in the last century would be able to pick out on a map, and I met someone who I don't think was human. It all started out so very plain. I woke up on a crappy bed that should have been thrown out last year, with springs that are killing my back. Went to work at 8 at the Home Depot on the only road that ever gets any traffic, but it's still just a 10-minute drive from my house. Work just passed by. A few customers would come in to get big loads for construction sites, but they mostly just need us for the forklift. They already know where pretty much everything is, and almost all the rest of the customers were looking for returns and refunds, or which all the bathroom seats were on. I clocked out at 4, nothing exciting happened, no weird customer, nothing. I went home and tried to make something. "What are you?" His smile got bigger. Hungry, almost too high of a voice for a man. Almost slurred. Then he began walking around me again, but this time felt different. When he stopped behind me, the girls' faces changed and the cries almost couldn't be covered anymore. Everything in me was telling me to turn around and try to fight for my life before the thing behind me took it without a fight. But I did nothing. As he was coming over my other side, his smile hadn't changed, but the way his eyes looked hasn't left me. Almost like they had sunk further into his face, but they contained an anger that hadn't been there before. But just like last time, he held up one finger, only this time I couldn't think of a better question. Then it came to me. "Who are you?" I barely stuttered out. His smile almost seemed to tear at the points of his mouth as he spoke. "Fun." Only this time his voice was almost split, like two people saying it at once. He tilted his head from side to side, almost debating on his next course of action. He settled on walking around me again, only this time he didn't stop behind me. His face looked almost unreal as he rounded my side. Like it couldn't decide if he was experiencing euphoria or anger so hot it would burn him alive. This time though, the finger that had been pointing at me was the one he held up. He kept making a swirly motion with it as if telling me this would be the last question. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to say so I could leave alive. I thought about asking to leave, but what about the rest of the people here? What happens once I leave? I still didn't understand what was happening now. I could only think of one thing to make it stop, one way, so the girls and those guys might be able to leave, so that someone might survive. I tried to summon all the bravery. I didn't have to ask him the next question. "Can you please leave?" I squeaked out. I don't think that's what he wanted to hear. His hand came right in front of my neck and he began snarling at me. He moved forward and began sniffing around me, almost smelling for something. It took him a minute before he seemed satisfied. When he pulled away, the look on his face began to change back to how he was when I first came over, but it had almost an amused look to it, like he had never been asked that question before. Then he leaned in close to my neck and ear. His breath was so cold if I couldn't see him in front of me I would think a freezer might have opened right next me. He whispered the last thing he said to me in my ear, but being careful not to touch me. "Alright," his voice sounded almost monotone. Like his fun had been killed. And then he began walking away into the darker parts of the night. I could hear him humming. It felt like hours before anyone moved. Almost scared to do anything to bring that thing back over. Finally one of the girls crawled over to one of the guys and began sobbing on his chest. And that's all it took for everything to turn into a blur of motion. I checked my phone and it hadn't even been 30 minutes since I first walked over. As the rest of the guys began waking up I noticed something strange going on between them. One of the guys almost jumped up and about fell over again. Looking for something. He left, I told him, but it didn't seem to be the response he was looking for. "Where's Alice? Where's Jenny?" This made the girls break down sobbing, and what they said next broke my heart. I should have realized it sooner. There was 6 guys and 4 girls when I arrived. That didn't mean that's all who came. One of the girls spoke up and said something barely understandable through her crying. "He ate them. He ate them," she said as she screamed the last part before her forehead touched the ground and her back began to heave as she struggled to breathe. I tried to talk to one of them about what happened, but no one seemed to want to say what exactly happened. But then the guy who asked about the girls looked at me and then he looked at the ground. We were just messing around, just talking about where we wanted to go get something eat that had enough space for all of us. He looked back up to me, tears in his eyes, almost pleading with me to understand him. Then he continued. "We go to the college at the edge of town. It's only a 20-minute walk to all the restaurants and we were just taking a shortcut when we dash." He stopped halfway, almost scared to say what happened next. Then we saw him standing there looking up at the sky, giggling to himself. He paused for a moment then continued. I asked him what was so funny about the sky, but he ignored me and kept giggling to himself. "You should have left him alone. All of you guys ould have left him alone." The girl next to him half screamed into his ear. I didn't know. He looked back up to me, but this time he was ashamed. He wasn't doing wrong, we just thought he was slow and it would be fun to mess with him a bit. So we walked up to him and began asking him questions. "What questions?" I interrupted him. "Just dumb stuff, you know. Like who he was and what was he doing giggling at the night sky behind a store." Everything was fine until he paused again. "Until we started touching him." I looked at him in disbelief, questions burning on my mind on what the hell it took for them to think that any of what they did was okay. But I needed different answers. At first it was just us touching his clothes. He never stopped smiling, so we thought it wouldn't hurt for us. "You thought he was harmless, you mean?" I cut him off again, only this time it was of frustration. "Yeah, we thought he was harmless. Okay, is that what you wanted to hear, huh? It's not like we were beating on him, we were just playing around. Until we weren't." His eyes look almost crazed with grief at this point. He was so fast and strong, almost like he wasn't even human. At first he was just throwing us around until Jake picked up a pipe and swung it at him. After that he stopped pulling his punches. And then it goes dark. He finished looking at the girls for an explanation. The brunette girl was the one who began talking despite looking in between her knees. Almost too scared to look at the world. "At the night. After he laid all of you out, he kept hitting you guys, so we tried to get him off you." She stopped and then started again. "Alice and Jenny hopped on his back, but it didn't matter. He slammed both of them into the pavement just as quick. But then he looked at us and we saw his face." "What about his face?" I asked. A different girl spoke up this time. "It wasn't normal, it almost looked like a mask of a face twisted in anger. But we all could feel the threat in the air." "What threat?" "If we moved or made a sound we'd die," she said quietly. But Jenny and Alice didn't want him to go back to beating the guys. So they fought back. It was in another couple of minutes before anyone said anything, but then she finally started up again. Jenny was the first one he started on. Her voice wavered. He grabbed her by her hair and thigh and shoved her down his mouth. And then in went Jenny. She finished. And then she looked over to me. And then you walked over. Taking another breath. And then we thought there was two of them. All of them broke down at the statement, so not knowing what else to do we decided to call the cops. We decided to tell them that a man who fit description of the thing that came here tonight, had abducted the two girls at gunpoint rather than what actually happened. No one would have believed anything about that night. The cops grilled all of us for weeks and pulled all the camera footage they could find. But the girls and the thing were never found again. Just gone. Like he had never been there that night. Even now my hands and fingers are shaking as I try to type this out. Trying to rationalize what happened as if words could ever capture the feeling and terror of that night, of him. I know no one who read this is gonna believe this, so I'll only ask one thing of you. No matter what they say or what they look like, don't talk to the things that roam the night. You never know if they've eaten yet.